Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this panel discussion. My name is Dr. Antonino Salmeri. I am the director of the Lunar Policy Platform. The Lunar Policy Platform is a global nonprofit organization dedicated to connect stakeholders for a prosperous and cooperative lunar future around priorities, policies, and standards. As you know, there are more than 100 lunar missions planned by the year 2030. And because of that, the development of an ability and framework and infrastructure to create and realize a peaceful, prosperous, and cooperative future on the moon has become one of the top priorities of contemporary space law and policymaking. To foster that conversation, the Lunar Policy Platform this year interviewed 40 stakeholders across different stakeholder groups, from governments to space agencies, companies, scientists, civil society organizations, and experts individuals, to identify which are the priority areas where we need to start in order to enable safe and sustainable lunar development. And the result of that work that lasted over the past couple of months was condensed in an innovative report on lunar policy priorities that the LPP has the pleasure to launch later today at the evening reception that we are co-hosting together with Secure World Foundation and Exotrail, and to which you are, of course, all invited. But in order to expand that conversation, we partnered with the Paris Space Forum. We are so delighted to be here to have a discussion on lunar policy priorities. And today, I am so delighted to be joined by a distinguished lineup of panelists representing different stakeholder groups that have been involved with LPP conversations and that will provide here different viewpoints on what are the priorities that we need to start with and how do we address them and how do we move forward with this new realm of space policy, which is lunar policy. So I'm joined here today by, starting from my left, Jean-Claude Worms, who is the Executive Director of COSPAR. Then we have Peter Weiss, who is CEO and founder of Spartan Space. Jean-Claude will speak on behalf, let's say, of the scientists, COSPAR being one of the most important scientific organizations in the field of space. And Peter, of course, as one of the entrepreneurs that will bring us to the moon and hopefully make us live there, will speak on behalf of the companies. On this side, we have Chris Johnson, who is Space Law Advisor at Secure World Foundation, one of our certainly valued partners, and also with LPP, a history of cooperation in the Moon Dialogues that maybe we can touch upon. Chris will bring a perspective of space law and, in general, civil society. And then we have Loreto Moraga, who is the president of the Asociación Chilena del Espacio, ACHIDE, who is here also to remind us that the moon is not only for companies and scientists, but it's for everybody, and especially, I would say, for emerging countries. So with this short introduction, I would like to begin our conversation about lunar policy priorities. And we're gonna essentially try to identify where do we start with lunar policy. So I would like to ask my panelists, what are the top 3 priorities that they see in lunar policy, the top 3 issues that have to be addressed, and why? And then we're gonna have a little conversation about it. And I would like to begin with Loreto, actually, to revert sometime the order that we have of this conversation and see from the perspective of an emerging country and emerging region of the world, what do you see are the top 3 priorities to be addressed?
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm honored to be here. This is really a great opportunity to bring here the voice of the emerging country in space. However, we have a lot of experience in something that is maybe similar to space, which is the Antarctic. And based on that experience, Chile is the only country that have operations all over the year in Antarctic, so we really know. And for 60 years, we have been very close to the Antarctic. That experience will maybe help us to contribute. Notwithstanding that we are an emerging country, we can anyway contribute. And I will say, answering your question, that a framework, a legal framework with at least the basis for the dialogue between the parties that not are necessary partners now, is the main thing. We need to get that countries that are not now actually doing things together, make them have dialogue, communication, coordination. Otherwise, we are not going to reach to anything. Inclusion, of course, that's the second one, for emerging countries. Avoid interference, And of course, infrastructure and interoperability is also very important. Otherwise, in fact, we are not going to have the opportunity to have access to the moon. Having more cost and having problems is something that is like prohibition for emerging countries to come in, because higher costs make us impossible to reach the moon or to reach the space activity. So to work in these three areas, I think, for us, for our perspective, are the main.
So legal framework, inclusion, and infrastructure and interoperability, those are three key aspects that also addressed in the report. You mentioned first legal, so I want to go to Chris. Given your space law background, what are your top three priorities, and where does the space law fit into setting also the priorities?
Thank you for the introduction and for allowing me to speak. Excellent questions. I have some perspectives on this. Likely we will hear a variety, a multiplicity of perspectives. First, where do we start? Well, first I think is, looking at all the different stakeholders, the different interests, the different opportunities that we want to do on the moon. And the moon is not merely just a place where we will go for national prestige purposes or a place where we'll go for commercial purposes. It's also a place we will go for scientific opportunities and scientific values. There's also security issues that relate to what we want to do on the moon. All of those interests seem to be valid and permissible, and there's no priority given to any one of them. But we need to accept that there are these differing visions of what we want to do in space and what we want to do on the moon. And let's survey those actors. Let's survey what they propose and see what's the scientific vision for the moon. I think next after that is looking at fora, looking at where discussions on lunar governance happen, and frankly just accepting polycentricity. And this is what we've heard from the folks at Open Lunar, that polycentricity is a function, is a feature, is a principal element of the international system and the international governance system. We just need to accept that there will be different norm entrepreneurs, norm socializers at a variety of different levels, at the highest international level, at the working group level in international fora, at the national level through national regulators, through civil society, through industry, through the scientific community. All of those actors will be promulgating, developing their own norms. And who's going to win out? Maybe sometimes the best rules, the most coherent, scientifically valid, commercially valid rules win out, but also sometimes really just a function of who their network is and how good they are at socializing it. So anyway, accepting polycentricity as a feature. And then lastly, it is one, studying the law that we have. We do not go to the moon, and it is a place where there is no law. In fact, we have true binding, in some sense vague, but nevertheless binding obligations and freedoms for what we want to do on the moon. You can find them in the Outer Space Treaty, the great freedoms of Article 1, exploration and use, but also those obligations of treating astronauts as envoys of mankind, the principles of responsibility and liability and jurisdiction control, those binding yet vague notions of cooperation, mutual assistance, due regard, and then some lunar-specific rules that we find in Article 4, Paragraph 2, the moon shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes, and that military installations, fortifications, and military maneuvers are prohibited on the moon. In addition, you mentioned Article 11 earlier, but look at Article 12 of the Outer Space Treaty, visitation rights on the moon, visitation on the basis of reciprocity to installations, fortifications, and in fact, vehicles on the moon. So we'll study what the law as it is in space law, maybe other areas of international law that are applicable to the moon, international environmental law, etc. But we also need to study law-making. How do we develop new rules? What is the best way to develop actually inclusive, equitable rules for the moon? Is it merely that the most immediate, coherent needs get the rules first, and those who have the clearest articulated rules get their rules first? Or is it merely that if you do it once, you set the principle and the precedent, and therefore the moon is up for grabs? You did it first? Or are we going to think thoroughly about our long-term interests, our long-term values on the moon, and incorporating some of those less defined or more attenuated interest on the moon, including intergenerational equity and including, non-traditional space actors and indigenous voices. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot of work to do.
Indeed, there is. And I mean, from your intervention, Kristen, thank you very much. I hear different things, right? One is trying to understand how we reconcile contributions from different stakeholders. Number two would be how do we start implementing the current principles that we have in the Outer Space Treaty? And then number three is how do we actually then move forward with this conversation? How do we actually implement and realize some practical outcomes? So I want to go now to key stakeholder groups that will hopefully play a crucial role on the moon, the scientists and the commercial activities. And beginning with Jean-Claude, what are your three priorities from the perspective of a scientific organization when we look at activities on the moon? And why do you think the voice of science, it's important to be heard? And where do you want to go next with that?
Thank you, Antonino. I'm not sure I have three. Well, I could find three, and I'll probably end up finding three, but I want to react immediately to what Christopher said. At some point, you said, who will win out, or do we want someone to win out? I think the idea here is to make sure that we have some kind of framework by which the future exploitation, the future use, the future scientific exploration of solar system bodies, including the moon, will continue to be feasible. And so that's where I would place the start, to make sure that we have a set, maybe not a global governance system from the start, but we have a set of norms of behavior for landing and operation specifically on the moon that allows continued exploration and use of the moon. So that would be my top priority, to make sure that we do not, from the start, as you said, by actors who would be there first and establish their own procedures, that we from the start are able to have a framework by which we can continue to do things there. Simple example, dust on the moon. If we start to do things on the moon, whatever they are, we will kick up dust that will stay for decades. And so we have an issue here, since this dust is probably toxic in addition. So it's not just us scientists who will be unhappy with that, it's also the industrials. It's also a number of other actors who will say, okay, we cannot work like this. So I understand, and if you look at the Lunar Priorities report that Antonino has already alluded to, the issue of global governance is probably the thing that will come last, in the sense that all actors need to work together for years and operate together in order to agree on things. But we need to start with a sort of almost ethical framework to guide these future regulations and how they are implemented. And so that's where I would place my priority. Sorry if I didn't go into the details of number 2 and number 3, but this is number 1, clearly.
Great, and number 1 is where we want to start. So thanks so much, Jean-Claude. Peter, do you want to react?
Yes, thank you, Antonino, for your invitation. And I will give the answer of an engineer here. Actually, for me, the number 1 priority is that any legal framework, any jurisdiction that is applied on the lunar surface needs to be followed by concrete actions. Just to avoid that we are in a situation like with this treaty between Spain and Portugal, I think, in the 15th century, where they divided the world in 2 parts. And that was a totally theoretical framework, and on the field, the reality was something else. And I fear a little bit the same for the moon, meaning, and here I'm speaking from a European perspective, meaning that if we are a nation that is not operating on the lunar surface, which is also the case maybe for emerging countries, that there is a risk that we have nowhere to speak. So one very important thing is that we do something on the lunar surface. And again, from the European perspective, right now the activity on the lunar surface are a little bit shy. So I hope there's a little bit more coming in the future. And then I just can underline other aspects that were already mentioned. Of course, the inclusion of economic activity, commercial activity. Often we say the moon is the stepping stone towards the solar system, and this is true. I mean, this is it will be the step towards going further. If we include this kind of activity right away, right from the beginning on, this will be like a case law that excludes any this kind of activity in future destinations. So it's extremely important to settle that right away, right now. And the third one is access. We have to make sure that we provide access to the various partners and entities that might be interested in lunar surface activity.
Great. And I mean, trying to combine together all the different points that were made, I see one key thread, which is the idea of sustainability and long-term look at what are we going to do on the moon and how it's going to impact what's coming next. So I think trying to go a little bit more into the details of that, I want to come back to Loreto. We mentioned before Antarctica as potentially an example. The Antarctic Treaty System evolved in about 50 years. And could it be that we will do the same for the moon? That we will start with this basic ethical understanding, I like what Jean-Claude said, and then we're going to develop into norms and then perhaps into legally binding rules. Do you see that as an analogy? And again, from the perspective of an emerging country, how do you wish to contribute to the development of all these principles, given that sometimes you lack the expertise, sometimes you lack interest in these activities? And space is big and a lot of things are going on, as we've seen today at the forum. So focusing on the moon, but why and how?
Well, we see some kind of analog situation here. But, basically, we are one of the countries that are closer to Antarctica and have also claims about sovereignty in Antarctica. And that gives some rights as a consultant country to resolve conflicts, to prevent conflicts. And so the political structure of governance is a key. How you assign the voting right, the voting power to each country. The one that is going to reach the moon is going to have more powers or not. I think that is a very important question, because the countries, the emerging one, as Chile, as the rest of the countries in Latin America, we are not going to be the one. We are not going to be the second or the third. We will need to have collaborative projects to reach the moon somewhere, somehow. But we would like, and I think is very important, to have any kind of a voting right, to have an opinion. Yeah, having an opinion, that will give us a chance to really reach the moon. Maybe not being there directly, but using the data, doing science, and try maybe to develop an ecosystem to provide services in this commercial industry related to the moon and space exploitation. We can also contribute from our experience in mining, for example. We have a lot of experience in the regulation of the mining, where you don't have any property, for example. So emerging countries, we need to be part of this activity in some way. And the governance, basic regulations on how we can communicate our opinion is the main thing for us. Maybe not having the same voting rights of the ones that are investing and are going to be first in the moon. But some kind, we need to have the opportunity to, from the beginning, having a vote.
Thank you. And I mean, Chris, you mentioned before polycentricity and the need to reconcile different actors, and what's the value of going first? Do you have the right to set precedent? Does any such thing exist under international space law? Do we have the right to set precedents? And Loreto was mentioning the idea of having developing countries somehow part of the conversation, but we do have the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space that is the place for the multilateral development of space law, but at the moment there is no specific attention to lunar issues. There is a working group on space resources, but so far there has not been an agenda item on lunar activities. So how do you see the role of COPUOS as the place that can bring together these actors and making sure that developing countries are part of the conversation vis-a-vis platforms like the Artemis Accords that are trying to move a conversation forward among those that want to participate, and eventually trying to reconcile also with the International Lunar Research Station from the China National Space Administration and other partners? How do we bring these actors together under the umbrella of international space law and our space treaty?
I won't say how we should do it. I'm going to say how I think it's going to happen, and it's going to be a bit messy in the sense that COPUOS will remain the main forum for discussion of the peaceful uses of outer space, including lunar actions. Maybe there will need to be a greater focus not just on space resources, but on lunar behavior. And there are benefits to COPUOS in the sense that it is, 102 member states. It is a forum of the UN. This is the place where discussions can happen out in the open. I can list the benefits of COPUOS. I can list some, demerits, some detractions from COPUOS, the idea that any state has a veto power, that you have to rely on consensus, that things can take a long time to develop. Those are features of the system. So let's accept that those are features of the system. In some sense, and we've seen this elsewhere. We saw this with the IADC space debris mitigation guidelines, developed by technical experts and scientific community outside of COPUOS, then delivered to COPUOS and said, here's what the scientific community has. COPUOS accepted those standards, developed their own more generalized standards on space debris. So in a sense, COPUOS can be a forum for discussion, in some sense, and it also can be a forum for the adoption of things developed elsewhere. How that will play out, I can't really predict, but we're already seeing that some states are taking things outside of the COPUOS forum. They're taking things through just minilateral or bilateral discussions like Artemis Accords, and some interaction between these two fora. If a fora wants to be fit for purpose for the next decade or few decades, wants to be the central fora, it has to be ambitious. And it's going to have to look at its rules, its format, its agenda, and actually say, if we don't discuss it, it's going to be discussed elsewhere. Maybe it's going to be discussed on the national level. Maybe it's going to be discussed, in other international fora, ITU, et cetera. So it's up to actors to be ambitious and to say, I think, the time is now. It's certainly on the horizon for serious discussions about lunar governance and lunar behavior.
Great. Jean-Claude, I want to go to you because COSPAR has a direct history of exactly what Chris mentioned with the planetary protection policies, right, which is a highly recognized international guideline that then COPUOS takes into account when it thinks about environmental protection of the moon. Are you looking into something similar for the future of the moon to protect the conduct of scientific activities in the future beyond just the search of life and the specific scope of the planetary protection? And does this model of COSPAR discussing and then bringing for consideration in COPUOS, do you see that as a feasible model from your perspective as a scientist?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. As you mentioned, COSPAR was the first actually observer to COPUOS in 1962. Those were the days. Now the environment is much more complex, and we cannot do things in the same way. But at the time, we were the privileged contact point and implementer of guidelines to guide observance of biological contamination of celestial bodies. So using this framework, as you suggest, to bring it forward to another level, to include other aspects of sustainable lunar exploration and sustainable space exploration in more generic terms, is exactly our idea at the moment. We have started with an internal conversation with all the relevant panels, those dealing with debris, those dealing with even social sciences and humanities as applied to space research. This is not just rocket science. Society has got its say here. So all these components, of course, have started the discussion on how to discuss first and incorporate these new aspects of sustainable space exploration into things that we could then propose to COPUOS as the next item on the agenda. Like for instance, we have an MOU, we have a memorandum of understanding with the UN COPUOS to deal with planetary protection, debris. We could enlarge that to other aspects if COPUOS decides that this is the way to do. They have this working group on long-term sustainability of space activities to which we're participating, so yes.
Excellent. Peter, companies do not really speak in COPUOS, they don't have a chance to participate in that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that ideas cannot be forwarded. There is a way to do it through national delegation, or there is also another way, which is companies can start work from a bottom-up process, the development of standards and providing, again, your own view so that it can be considered in decision-making and policy-making bodies. Or not.
Yes, that's a little bit my daily life at the moment. But before answering to your question, I would like to come back to the analogy with the Antarctica, because that's very interesting. But one has to keep in mind there's a big difference between Antarctica, which is a very interesting case because it is separated in different territories, very, very clearly regulated. The moon is significantly, or the lunar South Pole, at least if we talk about this region, which is of most highest interest in future exploration, we are talking about a very, very small region actually. Most of people are not aware we are talking about something that has the size approximately of Paris, a little bit larger than Paris. So I'm skeptical about that there will be some kind of regulation where you say, okay, there's a Chinese part in the lunar South Pole and an American part and whatever, European part. I do not believe this will be happening like that. And there's a very interesting aspect, of course, in the Artemis Accords, which are the safety zones, which unfortunately are right now not very well defined. We are not clear about the size, what we are talking about, and who's defining those. But I find this aspect of safety zones extremely interesting because, first of all, it will make sure there is no conflict, because we clearly, if everybody is respecting it, and secondly, it will also motivate nations to push a little bit quicker and faster to go to the lunar surface, because only once you have placed an item on the lunar surface, you will have right of a safety zone, and this is a great motivator. So actually, I'm quite a fan of that concept. So how this will be implemented then on an international basis, what you just mentioned with the Chinese and the US, and this is another question. And yeah, and the role of companies in there, of course, this is primordial for us. I mean, we see what's happening in the US with all the startups and new space economy that's also building up here in Europe, of course. While I must say, with our company, we are quite an extraterrestrial in the environment, because we really say we want to do something on a lunar surface. Many of them are working on launches and things like that. And but it is a difficult environment, because indeed, we have to fight for a place in there, and it is not about polluting the environment or exploiting the lunar surface. It's making it possible already to bring also this kind of elan into this whole adventure.
Jean-Claude, you had a whole pursuit.
Just because 2 or 3 people have mentioned the Artemis Accords already, I just want to react quickly. It's not my favorite model. You know, we're talking about bilateral agreements, and of course they're there, and we have to live with them. To me, I much prefer the model that was used at the time of the International Space Station, which was an international governmental agreement. Here we have a very different setting, and I don't think that, I'm not sure that's optimal.
All right. I mean, it's interesting, so many things that we could follow up. I mean, with Peter, we co-authored actually a paper on safety zone at the IC in Paris, trying to bring together the perspective of a scientist and a lawyer and see how they fit together. But I wanted to come back to Loreto and Chris, respectively, on this idea of trying to bring forward different perspectives. Again, does it exist actually a united perspective from the viewpoint of emerging countries? Like, do you have conversation among yourself? You know, for instance, countries going to the moon with the Artemis Accords, they have these conversations, they have working groups, they're discussing what do they think as a group. Do you have the same or not?
Unfortunately, what usually happens in Latin America is that we do not have that dialogue. Usually in Latin America we have like organizations depending on the political stage. If we have governments in the right or in the left, that is going to determine in which group you are, so that is a big problem. But there's the ALCE, the ALCE, the Latin America and Caribbean Space Agency, that there was an idea of coming from Mexico, and well, Chile is now thinking about being part of that project. But the problem is that we don't even have a space agency in Chile, so that also is a big problem. But we need to have these kind of conversations. But we are 10 steps behind. We don't even have the space agency. We don't even have a long-term budget. We don't even have people specialized in space in the government. So that is really a problem to even start a conversation. But I'm convinced personally, and our association, what is trying to push in our government is to have the proper people and to have an organization, a regional organization. Emerging countries need to be together in regional organizations. Otherwise, together we are going to succeed. Separately, we are going to fail absolutely in this huge opportunity to be part of this economy, a space economy. So regarding what you were saying about the Antarctica and the difference, I would like to come back with that idea because, yes, that is a big difference because the south pole of the moon is quite small. And also the commercial interest is something different that we have in Antarctica. Yeah, now the Antarctic Agreement is going to expire and then we're going to see what is going to happen. But at least there's some kind of a governance that may work from the moment that expired the Antarctic Agreement. But how we understand and how we conciliate the commercial interest aligning with the general interest of taking care of the environment and go after the scientific exploration of the moon and the space is the main challenge. But as Latin American, we need to have regional discussion and the proper people appointed to do that. Yeah.
Indeed, and I think the importance of facilitating discussion is one of the key objectives of the Lunar Policy Platform and the project that started also because of the support of Open Lunar that we're also very grateful for. It's exactly the idea of also providing means for these conversations to happen. And so capacity building is also another aspect that we haven't had time to discuss, but that's going to be a priority. If we really want to have inclusive conversation, we need to be able to ensure that everyone can participate. And sometimes you lack the expertise, sometimes you lack the resources, and perhaps someone else should provide those resources or work with you. And so from the LPP perspective, that's something that will be probably one of our goals in 2024 is to work with emerging regions so that they get the minimum level of knowledge they need to participate in these discussions. I think that's so important because otherwise we risk to miss a part of the world in this important conversation. I want to move towards the final theme that we're going to discuss, but I also want to invite the audience to think about questions. We'll try to leave about 5 minutes for a short Q&A with our panelists, and of course later on we'll have the reception, so we can continue these conversations informally. But if you have anything that you would like to address, please think about it. I will come back to you in a moment. But Chris, trying to look at the future, right? We said 100 lunar missions by 2030, and policy is currently very limited, right? We have the Aerospace Treaty, we have the Artemis Accords, but nothing actually concrete that tells us how do we ensure safe landing on the moon. Jean-Claude mentioned it before. How do we ensure interoperability? It was mentioned as well. So if you look at the next 3 years, or maybe a little bit more, it doesn't have to be exactly that timeline, but if you look in the short term, what are the policy deliverables that we need so that those 100 missions on the moon by 2030 can succeed, and that can succeed in a sustainable and safe manner?
Easy question. Well, let me ask first a question to the rest of the panel, a question to the audience in person and those online. Can non-spacefaring states set space law and inform space law and shape space law? If you are not going to the moon, do you have any say in the emergence of lunar rules? What's the answer to that? Should they? If you're not going to the moon, and should you have a right to speak on what lunar law should be? The answer, we know. Yes, you're allowed. You sign the Outer Space Treaty. It not only creates some obligations on you, it gives you rights and freedoms and privileges. If you are a member state of COPUOS, you have certain rights and privileges to participate. And so certainly, you know, and Peter, this is what you were touching on before about, you know, Germany and European states getting to the moon. Yeah, you want to, you know, be involved in lunar activities, but if you are, you know, enjoy those rights of international space law and those rights of being a member state, you should be involved in lunar governance discussions. And so, yeah, that gets to that notion of capacity building and what are our priorities for, you know, the short term. I think it is, in a sense, making sure, you know, the people who are most concerned about it know who the other actors are, know what the different views that we have for the moon, the scientific vision for the moon, the commercial vision for the moon, the national prestige exploration vision for the moon, including maybe some of the security visions for the moon. And we're never going to harmonize all those visions for the moon, but can we get the security folks to listen to the scientific folks? Can we get the commercial folks to listen to the scientific folks? Can we get those folks together in a room? This is what the role of civil society is. It is not just capacity building and education, but it's convenings like this, convenings that can happen elsewhere and at COPUS, getting those folks in the room to understand the perspectives, interests, and anxieties of the other stakeholders that we have on the moon. You know, in my last remark, last minute, what I'd like to say is, we've heard a little bit about the scientific opportunities on the moon from Jean-Claude. Within the International Astronomical Union, the IAU, which has various working on dark and quiet skies, there is going to be a newly established working group on protection of lunar astronomy and protecting the vision and views of interests of lunar astronomy and astronomers on the moon. I will be co-chairing that with Dr. Martin Elvis of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. We intend to engage in a polycentric fashion, both with COPUS at STSC, with conference room papers, statements, but also with the ITU and with study groups at the ITU that are looking at behavior out in space. That's one of the things that we can do. Get the astronomers educated on how to interact with other stakeholders, and in addition with all the other scientific actors. We have a lot of capacity building to do, and so if you're interested in this, as I said before, the time is ripe to really foster these discussions.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And it's great to know that the IU is starting to get involved in this conversation. One of the proposals that the report addresses, the annex to the report addresses for the future, is the idea of a lunar policy decalogue, 10 different instruments that we might want to produce in the future. And one of them is on science and ethics. And I think having the input of the IAU and perhaps having the IAU and COSPER working on these developments, it's going to be key, because all these different deliverables that we need cannot be produced by one body. No one has the capacity, and no one should have the right to settle everything. Everything has to be distributed and divided.
I just realized I only said scientific value, commercial value, potential military, and national prestige. Those are not the only visions that we have for the future and for the moon. I forgot to include all the people who are not looking at the space industry, but they rely on space. They are also, enjoy freedoms of exploration. They benefit from the night sky. They benefit from astronomy and space sciences. Everyone else who's not in the space industry, their views are also valid.
And I think in the working group in COPUS on space resources, there was the idea of bringing the perspective of indigenous communities and minorities to make sure, again, that we don't miss out. I want to go to Jean-Claude. What do we need, from your perspective, by 2026, one deliverable or two deliverables that, from your perspective, are key to have so that when we do activities on the moon, we do it safely and sustainably?
I hope you're not expecting something at a technical level, because what I want is looping back to what I said at the beginning. I think the first thing we need is a sort of ethical framework to guide our approach there. And we need something broad, something generic that would guide us in establishing further regulations and practices. And I want to submit to you such a possible ethical framework, one that would say, do not do unrepairable damage or harm to celestial bodies except where it's absolutely vital for humankind, like an asteroid's coming at us. You want to do damage to the asteroid, right? So don't degrade the environment. Don't allow the environment to be degraded by doing nothing. Then, in order of priority, progress knowledge, obviously, and use by space exploration and utilization, except if it means harming the environment of those bodies. And then third, and lesser priority, protect your assets out there, except when it means breaking the rules above. And so if there are science fiction fans among you, you might have recognized the approach followed by Isaac Asimov with his 3 laws of robotics. So I give you the 3 laws of space exploration, which I've just alluded to.
Perfect. Thank you, Jean-Claude. I think that's an excellent starting point for further conversation. And Peter, what are your 3 laws of space exploration?
The priority, safety zones. I'm clearly about that. This needs to be defined, because I think it's maybe a first step. almost. But I agree with you that Artemis Accords can be improved, of course. But I'd like to come back what you just said about the non-spacefaring nations. I'd like to reformulate it a little bit in a sense what I said at the beginning. I think the actors that are not active on the surface will not have the possibility to define law that is the jurisdiction for lunar surface. That is my feeling. Should it be like that? No, of course not. But I think at the end of the day it will be like that. Look just what's happening in the maritime sector. You are talking about mining, subsea mining. Who are the nations who are just pushing in there because they have the money and the technology and the will to go there? And who are the countries who are discussing a lot about it and maybe not having any mining activity in the meanwhile? And I fear on the lunar surface it will be a little bit the same game. Unfortunately, I don't say I like it, but I see it like that. And this is people have to understand it. Very important to bring this to a clear solution, because, as I said before, the nations that will not be active in this field will not be driving. They will be sitting on the passenger seat. And that's, by the way, that's a problem not of the agencies, of the national agencies or over-national agencies. It's a problem of policy. It's a problem of the government. They have to decide to go there. And as I said, the lunar surface, and especially the lunar South Pole, is a highly strategic place.
Thank you, Peter. I'm glad you mentioned also maritime law, because on the one hand, there are the risks that you mentioned, but in the discussion this morning, Tanya mentioned the fact that there has been a new treaty in maritime law to protect the biodiversity in marine environment. And that is something that we all did not expect, and I think it's a sign of hope for the community to be able to agree on key aspects of the regulation that we need to have in place. We have about 4 minutes, so I want to see if there is any question from the audience that we can take for the panel. And I recognize two. We have that gentleman was first, and then we can go there. If you could be very brief and introduce yourself at the beginning, that would be appreciated.
Thank you very much. My name is Ashton Stewart Carter. I'm CEO of a consultancy called TDI Sustainability, and we advise corporates and governments on natural resource governance and policy. You just brought it up. My kind of point was one of the things we've been working on is deep sea minerals, and we've been convening with the World Economic Forum, a dialogue between different parties on deep sea minerals. I'm wondering, I see lots of parallels here. Here is a setting where many of the countries who are involved don't actually go down to the ocean floor. There's my science versus your science. There's the difficulty in getting people in the same room and trying to find an objective and talk about it. One thing you haven't mentioned is the commercial implications, not just those who wins, but who loses. And that's one thing which is happening with DSM as well. What's going to happen to the Congo if they have all the cobalt found at the bottom of the sea? So I wonder if the panel also sees parallels there. And of course, the ISA has been exploring down there for 50 years or so. So there could be good lessons and also bad lessons. Second part of that question is, very quickly, is in the case of the deep sea minerals, the sustainability piece, so the environmental sustainability, is represented by conservationists, and they can make the case because there's a causal relationship between the health of the ocean floor and, putatively, the health of us. Can such a case be made in a lunar setting?
That's great. Two questions. Who wants to take them? Parallels with deep seabed mining and whether or not someone has any direct correlation to what's happening on the moon.
Well, the moon is not just going to be a place where we mine. It's going to be a place that we want to, in addition to the various, different physical characteristics of the differences between the deep sea bed and the moon, it is a place where we'll want to inhabit. We want to put people on the moon for long periods of time. We want to inhabit lunar caves. We want to inhabit permanently shadowed regions. There's mining interest, but there's going to be scientific interests and a variety of different interests. They're all going to have to be balanced somehow, and none is given precedent at this point.
Thank you. Loretta.
Yeah, well, in our country we have this discussion between the space mining and the ocean mining, because there is a challenge for a country as Chile. We are the first copper producers in the world, so for us mining is the future of the country as well. And basically what we are thinking is, well, space mining is a different concept, because it's not only about the exploitation to bring or use minerals. Also is basically is to look for water, is to provide support to the space missions. So we see that it's not that difficult to conciliate the commercial interest and the set of the space missions, in the moon or in Mars. So we don't see that it's that far. Then you're going to have the asteroids and the exploitation of asteroids. That is going to be after. The concept is wide. So that's what can I say.
I completely agree, and I think it's important to remind that mining on the moon is also meant to be for in situ resources utilization. And so it serves the purpose of supporting sustainability, as we also read in the Artemis Accords. And so in a way, it's kind of different than what we want to do on the deep sea bed, which is like for pure commercial profit, which on the moon is not exactly happening at this stage. We only have 20 seconds, so I have to wrap up. I'm very sorry I couldn't get more questions, but please do come to us and talk to us at the end of this panel and tonight at the reception that will start at 6:30 together with LPP, Secure World Foundation, and ExoTrail. But I want to thank all my panelists for such an interesting and lively discussion. There is a lot of work to do in lunar policy, but the Lunar Policy Platform and all the partners are ready to do that. So I would encourage you to read the report on Lunar Policy Priorities. We're going to distribute it later tonight. And please engage with us for this important conversation for the future of humanity. Thank you all very much.